On their wedding night, Dante leaves her alone in a luxury hotel, without a single explanation, disappearing to deal with a brutal gang war. 3 months later, he returns to discover that his abandoned bride is pregnant. But the child isn't his. It is the result of one final night Elena shared with her former lover before she was forced into the marriage. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The rain hit the windows of the Marchetti house like knuckles on a door that no one wanted to answer, and Elena stood at the top of the staircase in her mother's old silk robe, listening to men argue about her life as if she weren't standing close enough to hear every word of it. "You don't understand what you're asking of me, Sal." That was Vincent Russo's voice, low, funeral parlour calm, the kind of calm that made the hair rise on the back of Elena's neck. Vincent was Dante Russo's uncle and consigliere, a man who smiled at weddings and funerals with the exact same expression. "This isn't a request. 3 years ago, your husband, God rest him, took a loan from my nephew's organization that he never intended to repay. He used our money to buy guns for a war he lost. Men died because of your husband's ambition, Sal. Russo men. That debt didn't die with him. It came to you." "I have money," her father said, and Elena could hear the particular thinness in his voice, the one he used when he was afraid and trying not to show it. "Whatever the interest is, whatever the number is, I'll find it." "It was never about money," Vincent said. "Dante doesn't need your money. He has an empire that touches every dock, every union hall, every casino floor between here and Detroit. What he doesn't have is the Marchetti name tied cleanly into it. A blood alliance. A marriage seals what money can't. Your daughter for the debt. That is the offer. It is generous, considering what it could have been instead." Elena's stomach dropped through the floor. She had known, in the vague way one knows about weather forecasts for a week that hasn't come yet, that her father's business dealings were rotting somewhere beneath the surface. Salvatore Marchetti ran the smallest of the 5 families that divided Chicago's underworld between them, and everyone in that world had always known the Marchettis punched above their weight and would eventually be made to answer for it. Elena had simply never imagined that the answer would be her. She came down the stairs before she could talk herself out of it, her bare feet silent on the marble, and both men turned. Her father's face went the colour of old paper. Vincent Russo's did not change at all. He only looked at her the way a jeweller looks at a stone he is deciding whether to buy, turning her over in the light of his mind, checking for flaws. "Elena." Her father moved as if to block her, as if there were anything left to hide. "Go back upstairs." "No," she said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out, though her hands, hidden in the folds of the robe, were shaking. "I want to hear the rest of it, since apparently it concerns me." Vincent's mouth curved, not quite to smile. "She has spine. Good. Dante won't want a wife who folds at the first hard word." He looked to Salvatore. 3 days, Sal. The wedding will be at Santa Maria del Popolo, the reception at the peninsula. Dante will handle the arrangements. You need only deliver the bride. I'd advise you not to make him wait longer than necessary. He isn't a patient man, and this is the only mercy he's offering. After the door closed behind him, after the black car pulled away down the wet street, Salvatore Marchetti sat down at his own kitchen table, and put his face in his hands. And Elena stood in the doorway watching her father, a man she had feared and loved, and never once seen cry, shake with something that might have been grief or might have been simple animal terror. "Papa," she said quietly, "tell me it's a bluff. Tell me there's another way." "There's no other way." He didn't look up. Dante Lusso could have taken this house. He could have taken the business, the men, everything I've built, and left you with nothing. And no one in this city would have said a word against him for it. He could have had me killed in my own bed and called it justice, and men would have nodded and gone back to their dinners. Instead, he's asking for a marriage. He finally raised his eyes to her, and what she saw there frightened her more than anything Vincent Russo had said. "He's being kind, Eleanor. Do you understand? This is Dante Russo being kind." She thought of Marco then. She couldn't help it, the thought arriving unbidden and total, like a light switched on in a dark room. Marco Ferretti, who worked the docks for a rival crew, whose hands she knew better than her own, who had told her 100 times in the dark of his apartment above the bakery that someday, somehow, they would find a way to be together despite their families, despite everything. She thought of his mouth against her temple, his voice low and certain. "I don't care whose daughter you are. I'll find a way." There would be no way now. "When?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "Saturday." Her father's voice broke on the word. "I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Cara. I never meant for it to land on you." "You never mean for anything," Eleanor said, and immediately regretted the cruelty of it, though she didn't take it back. She turned and went back up the stairs to her room, and she did not cry until the door was closed, and even then she cried quietly, the way she had learned to do everything in that house, quietly, so as not to disturb the men making decisions about her life in the rooms below. She had 4 days left as herself. She intended to spend at least one of them saying goodbye to the person she couldn't marry. That night, past midnight, she climbed out through the kitchen door the way she had 100 times before, walked 6 blocks in the rain to the bakery on Taylor Street, and knocked on the side door until Marco came down in a t-shirt and bare feet and opened it, and saw her face and knew, before she said a single word, that something had ended. "Elena." He pulled her inside, out of the rain, his hands finding her face, her shoulders, checking her the way he always did, as if her body might have news his eyes could read faster than her voice could tell it. "What happened? Tell me what happened." "I'm getting married," she said. "Saturday. To Dante Russo." The name landed on him like a physical blow. She watched him absorb it, watched the colour leave his face. Marco was not a small man, not an unconnected one. The Ferretti crew ran numbers and protection on the near south side, small potatoes compared to the Russo empire, but not nothing. And even he flinched at the name, the way everyone in that city flinched at it, the way you'd flinch from a name that belonged less to a man than to a kind of weather system, an unavoidable force that reorganized whatever it touched. "No," he said. "No, there has to be. Elena, there has to be another way. I'll talk to your father. I'll talk to my father. We'll figure out—" "There's no figuring out a blood debt, Marco." She was crying now, openly, and she let herself, because there was no one here to perform strength for. "My father owes him for the war 3 years ago. I'm the payment." He held her for a long time without speaking, his chin resting on the top of her head, and she felt him trembling too, though whether from fear or fury, she couldn't tell. "I love you," he said finally, into her hair. Whatever happens after Saturday, I need you to know that whatever they make you become, whatever name they put on you, I love you. And that isn't going to change because a priest says some words over you. She should have said no. She should have walked home and locked her door and prepared herself the way a soldier prepares for a battle she cannot win but must survive. Instead, she stayed the night in his narrow bed above the bakery that smelled permanently of yeast and sugar, and let him love her one last time, as if loving him enough might undo what was coming, might rewrite the debt in some other currency entirely. It didn't. Of course it didn't. But she didn't know yet what that single night would cost either of them. Didn't know that some debts, once incurred, come due whether or not you're ready to pay them, and that this one would take 3 months to announce itself, and would nearly cost her everything when it did. Santa Maria del Popolo had not seen a wedding this large in a decade, and the whole of it felt to Elena like a funeral dressed up in white lilies. The kind of event where everyone wears their finest clothes and speaks in hushed, respectful voices. And somewhere beneath the flowers, a body is being put in the ground. She stood in the vestibule in a gown she hadn't chosen, made by a designer she hadn't hired, paid for, she assumed, by the Russo family, since her father's finances had apparently not stretched to cover his own daughter's wedding. The dress was beautiful in the cold, exacting way of everything else about this day. Ivory silk, a neckline that dared to be modest and somehow managed to look more devastating for it. A veil so long it took 2 of her cousins to arrange the train. She looked, in the mirror they propped against the wall, like a woman being delivered somewhere rather than a woman arriving of her own will. "You look beautiful," her father said, standing beside her in his best suit, his eyes red-rimmed, though he'd clearly tried to hide it. "Your mother would have—" "Don't," Elena said. "Don't talk about Mama today, please." He fell silent, and they stood together without speaking until the music began. And then he took her arm, and the great doors of the church opened, and she saw, for the first time in her life, Dante Russo. She had heard about him for years, everyone in that world had, but she had never actually stood in a room with him, and nothing she'd heard had prepared her for the reality of it. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way his impeccably tailored black suit didn't hide so much as sharpen, and he stood at the altar with the stillness of a man who had trained himself out of nervous movement the way other men train muscle. His hair was dark, threaded faintly with premature grey at the temples, that only made him look more dangerous rather than older. And his eyes, when they found hers, walking down that long aisle on her father's arm, were the flat, assessing grey of a winter sky, giving away absolutely nothing. He did not smile. He did not soften. He watched her come toward him, the way, she thought with a chill, he probably watched everything, as a problem to be evaluated, a piece to be placed on a board. The ceremony passed in a blur she would never afterward be able to fully reconstruct. She remembered the priest's voice, rising and falling in Latin and English. She remembered her own voice, saying the vows, thin and strange to her own ears, as though someone else were speaking them on her behalf. She remembered Dante's voice when he said his, deep, unhurried, utterly without tremor, a man making a business commitment rather than a sacred one. She remembered his hands when he took hers to place the ring. They were warm. She hadn't expected that. Somehow she had imagined a man like Dante Russo would run cold all the way through, and the warmth of his hands against her cold fingers felt like an intimacy she hadn't consented to, more unsettling in its way than anything else about the day. "You may kiss the bride." He leaned down, and for one suspended second she thought he might simply brush her cheek, the way men in arranged marriages did in the films her mother used to watch, a kiss for the audience and nothing more. Instead, his mouth found hers directly, and it was not gentle, and it was not performative. It was thorough and searching, and it lasted a half-second longer than propriety required, long enough that she felt the church go very quiet around them, long enough that when he finally drew back, she had to remind herself to breathe. His eyes, so close to hers, gave her nothing to read, but something had passed between them in that kiss that she couldn't name and didn't like, a current, low and electric, entirely against her will. The reception was held at the Peninsula, in a ballroom drowning in white roses. 300 guests from both sides of a divide that had, until 4 days ago, been considered permanent. Elena moved through it like a ghost at her own party, accepting congratulations from men whose names she recognized as her father's rivals, and men she recognized as Russo capos, all of them treating her with the same careful, appraising courtesy, as if she were a treaty rather than a bride. Dante barely spoke to her all evening. He danced with her once, formally, his hand at the small of her back light but absolute, steering her with an authority that made resistance feel not merely futile, but almost beside the point, a fact of physics rather than a choice. Up close, she could see the fine white scar that cut through one eyebrow, could smell cedar and something colder beneath it, gunmetal maybe, or just the particular smell of danger she'd learned to recognize her whole life without ever standing this close to its source. "You didn't have to marry me tonight," she said quietly as they turned beneath the chandeliers. "You could have taken the business and let it end there. My father said so himself." "Your father talks too much," Dante said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her since the vows. His voice was low, meant only for her. "This isn't cruelty, Eleanor. It's architecture. A marriage binds two families in a way a debt repayment never fully does. Men remember blood ties longer than they remember favours." "So I'm architecture." Something flickered behind his eyes. She couldn't tell if it was amusement or irritation. "Tonight, yes. Tomorrow, we'll see what you are." She wanted to ask him what that meant. She wanted to ask him 100 things. Why his uncle had negotiated the marriage and not him. Why he'd looked at her the entire ceremony like a man doing arithmetic. Why his mouth on hers had felt like something other than a formality. But the song ended, and he stepped back and inclined his head with perfect, cold courtesy and moved off into the crowd of men waiting for him with the particular urgency of business that could not wait even for a wedding night. She didn't see him again until nearly midnight, when a Rousseau soldier, a quiet, broad man named Aldo, who would, she would learn, become almost the only friendly face in her new life, appeared at her elbow and told her the car was ready to take her to the hotel. "Where's my husband?" she asked, testing the word in her mouth, finding it foreign. Aldo's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Russo has business tonight, Mrs. Russo. He asked me to see you to the ambassador suite and to tell you he'll explain when he can." "Business? On his wedding night?" "Yes, ma'am." Aldo did not meet her eyes, and something in his careful blankness told her this was neither ordinary nor something he was permitted to discuss. "The car is waiting." She rode alone through the wet Chicago streets in her wedding gown, the city lights sliding past the window like something underwater, and understood, with the particular clarity that sometimes arrives in moments of humiliation, that whatever kind of marriage this was going to be, it had already begun exactly as it meant to continue, with her waiting, in silence, for a man who did not think he owed her an explanation for anything at all. The ambassador suite at the top of the hotel was the kind of room that existed to communicate power rather than comfort. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the whole glittering spine of the city. A bed the size of a small boat. Champagne sweating in silver ice that no one had touched. Elena stood in the middle of it in her wedding dress at 1 in the morning and felt for the first time since Vincent Russo had said her name in her father's kitchen the full weight of what had actually happened to her life. She was married to a stranger who had left her here, alone, without so much as a note. She sat at the edge of the enormous bed and worked the pins out of her hair one by one, watching herself in the mirrored closet doors, a bride undressing herself, no husband to help. No mother to sit with her the way she'd always imagined this night would go, back when she was young enough to imagine weddings as something other than transactions. She thought of Marco's hands in her hair 4 nights ago, gentle and familiar, and had to press the heel of her palm hard against her mouth to keep from making a sound. She did not cry in the end. She told herself this was a kind of victory, though it felt more like numbness curdling into something harder. 2 hours later, near 3 in the morning, her phone buzzed against the marble of the nightstand. A text from an unknown number that she would later learn belonged to Dante himself. Stay in the suite. Do not leave the hotel for any reason. Aldo is stationed outside your door. This is not a request. No explanation, no apology, not even a name signed to it, as if he assumed she would simply know. She typed back, furious, "Where are you?" The reply took 20 minutes to arrive. "Somewhere you can't be tonight. I'll explain when I can. Lock the door." She threw the phone onto the bed and stood at the window instead, watching the lights of the city she had lived in her whole life and had never truly understood the underside of. Not really. Not until 4 days ago. Somewhere out there, her husband was doing something he considered more urgent than his own wedding night, and she had no way of knowing whether that something was business or blood, whether he'd come back at all, whether she was now a widow in everything but name before the marriage had even begun to mean anything. She didn't sleep. Around dawn, she finally changed out of the wedding dress, hung it with more care than it probably deserved, and lay on top of the covers in one of the hotel robes, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion took her under, despite everything. 3 days passed like that. Aldo brought her meals and answered none of her questions with anything beyond, "I'm not able to say, Mrs. Russo," delivered with an apologetic weight that suggested he genuinely wished he could. She was not permitted to leave the hotel. She was not permitted visitors, not even her father, who called twice and was, according to Aldo, turned away at the lobby by men who were not Aldo and did not share his gentleness. She read every book in the sweet small shelf of leather-bound classics no one had ever actually opened. She watched the news, hunting for some clue about what business could possibly justify abandoning a bride for days on end, and found nothing but a brief mention on the 3rd night of gunfire on the west side that had left 2 men dead outside a warehouse the news anchor did not name the owner of. She understood, watching that story, more than Aldo had ever confirmed for her. A war. Whatever this was, It was a war, and her husband was somewhere in the middle of it, and she was a woman locked in a gilded room 3 floors above the city, married to a man whose name she carried and whose face she had seen for exactly 1 evening of her life. On the 4th day, Vincent Russo came to see her instead. He arrived without warning, immaculate as ever, and sat across from her at the small table by the window, with the particular ease of a man who was completely unbothered by her anger. "You've made yourself a nuisance to my nephew's men," he said, not unkindly. "Complaining to Aldo won't get you answers, Elena, and it reflects badly on you. A Russo wife handles herself with more composure." "I am not yet convinced I want to be a Russo wife," Elena said. "I was married 4 days ago to a man who has not spoken to me since, who has left me locked in a hotel room like a possession he forgot to unpack. If this is what the marriage is, I would like to understand the terms of it, at minimum." Something in Vincent's expression shifted, a fraction of respect entering the calculation. "Dante is dealing with an incursion from the Sartori family. 3 weeks ago they hit 2 of our shipments and killed 6 of our men. He is currently occupied ensuring that does not happen a 3rd time. It is not personal to you, Eleanor, whatever it feels like. It is simply the truth that my nephew has an empire to protect, and empires do not pause for honeymoons." "Then why marry me at all, if I'm so unimportant to the actual business of his life?" Vincent studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its polish, become almost briefly honest. "Because alliances matter more in wartime, not less. Your father's name, tied to ours, closes a door the Sartoris might otherwise have used. You didn't marry a man, Eleanor. You married a strategy. I'd advise you to make peace with that distinction quickly. It will save you a great deal of grief in the years ahead." He left without telling her when Dante would return, and she sat alone afterward with his words settling into her like sediment, understanding for the first time the true shape of the life she had married into. Not a man, not even really a family, but a machine that ran on debts and blood and timing, and into which she had been fed as a single moving part. She thought of Marco again that night. She couldn't stop thinking of him, no matter how she tried, and wondered, with a guilt she couldn't fully suppress, whether he was lying awake somewhere too, thinking of her, or whether he had already understood, the way she was starting to, that some doors close so completely there's no use standing at them anymore. She did not yet know that a single night with him had left something inside her that would, in 3 months' time, force open every door in this marriage that Dante Russo had ever tried to keep closed. The Sartori War, as it came to be known in the hushed conversations of men who thought Eleanor couldn't hear them, lasted 11 weeks. Eleanor spent all 11 of them in a Russo-owned townhouse on Astor Street that Dante had transferred her to after the first week at the hotel. A beautiful prison, with a walled garden and a housekeeper named Rosa, who treated Eleanor with a gentleness that felt, at times, like the only real kindness in her new life. She saw Dante exactly twice in those 3 months. The first time was 5 weeks in, when he arrived at 2 in the morning with a bandage wrapped around his forearm beneath his shirt sleeve, and blood, not his own, she prayed, though she never asked, dried at his collar. She had woken to the sound of the front door, and come downstairs in her nightgown to find him standing in the dark kitchen, drinking whiskey straight from a glass with his eyes closed, looking for one unguarded moment before he heard her on the stairs, less like a kingpin and more like an exhausted man carrying something too heavy to set down. "You're hurt," she said. His eyes opened, and the exhaustion vanished behind the same flat composure she remembered from their wedding. "It's nothing." "You could at least tell me if you're alive from one week to the next," she said, anger rising faster than she'd expected, 3 weeks of loneliness finding its exit all at once. "I'm your wife. I read about gunfire on the news and don't know if it's you being shot at. Do you understand what that does to a person, not knowing?" "I understand it perfectly," he said, and something in his voice, quiet, almost rough, made her fall silent. "That is precisely why I don't tell you anything, Elena. The less you know about what I do, the safer you are if anyone ever comes looking for a way to hurt me through you. Ignorance is the only shield I can give you right now. It isn't cruelty. It's the only kindness available to me at this particular moment in my life." Well, that's a very convenient excuse for a man who doesn't want to bother explaining himself. For a moment, she thought she'd finally provoked something real out of him. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. He took one step toward her with an intensity that made her breath catch. But then he stopped himself, visibly, the way a man reins in a horse at the very edge of a cliff, and the distance between them stretched taut and silent. "Go back to bed, Elena," he said finally, very quietly. "I'll be gone before you wake." He was. She found only the whiskey glass, washed and set to dry, and the faintest smell of cedar and gunmetal lingering in the kitchen, like proof she hadn't dreamed him. The second time was nearly 2 months later, and it lasted less than 10 minutes. He came to collect papers from the study, spoke perhaps 6 sentences to her in total, and left again before she'd even fully processed that he was in the house. But in those 10 minutes, she noticed things she hadn't let herself notice before. The way his eyes tracked her across the room, even while his hands were occupied with the papers, quick and assessing, and somehow hungrier than his voice ever let on. The fact that he'd had Rosa hired specifically for Elena's comfort, a detail Rosa let slip without meaning to when she mentioned that Mr. Russo had personally interviewed her before the wedding even took place, asking pointed questions about whether she'd be kind. The fact that the townhouse, for all its distance, was stocked with everything Elena might want, the specific brand of tea she preferred, books by authors she'd mentioned once in passing to Aldo, who must have reported it faithfully up some invisible chain that led eventually to Dante himself. He was cataloguing her, attending to her, from a great and careful distance, as though he did not trust himself to get any closer. She didn't understand it that spring, the strange mathematics of a man who could abandon her for months and still know precisely how she liked her tea. She only knew that something about it unsettled her more than open cruelty would have, cruelty she could have hated cleanly. This half-attention, this careful architecture of comfort from a man who refused to be present in it, left her in a kind of suspended anger she didn't have a name for yet. It was in the 9th week, in the loneliness of that beautiful house, that she first understood something else was wrong. A tiredness that sleep didn't touch, a nausea in the mornings she initially blamed on Rosa's rich Sunday cooking, a missed cycle she'd tried to attribute to stress. She did the math in the quiet of her bathroom with a test she'd sent Aldo to buy without telling him what it was for, watching 2 pink lines resolve out of white plastic with the same slow horror of watching a car crash unfold from a distance too great to stop it. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time after that, doing arithmetic of a different kind. 11 weeks since the wedding night alone, the week before it at Marco's apartment above the bakery, the last night she would ever spend as a free woman. There was no universe in which this child belonged to Dante Russo. She pressed both hands flat against her stomach, feeling nothing yet, no flutter, no proof beyond the plastic stick sitting accusatory on the sink's edge, and understood with total clarity that she had just become the single most dangerous woman in the entire Russo family. Not through any act of violence, but through the simple, unbearable arithmetic of a debt she owed to one man and a child she was carrying for another. She thought, absurdly, of her father's voice in the kitchen 4 months ago. This debt didn't die with him, it came to you. She had thought then that she understood the shape of the debt she'd been made to pay. She was only now beginning to understand that debts like this one had a way of compounding. Generation over generation, choice over choice, until the person paying them barely resembled the person who'd first incurred them at all. Dante Russo was due back from the war within the month. She had exactly that long to decide what she was going to tell him, and no idea at all what a man like him would do with the truth once she did. To understand what Elena carried into that marriage, you have to go back further than the wedding, further than the debt itself, to the summer 2 years earlier when Marco Ferretti first kissed her in the alley behind the bakery on Taylor Street, with flour still dusting his forearms, and told her, laughing, that he'd fallen for the daughter of his family's rivals, like the plot of some old opera his grandmother used to hum. They had been careful at first, careful the way young lovers on opposite sides of old wars learn to be, meeting in places neither family had reason to look, at hours when neither family had reason to ask where they'd gone. Marco worked the docks under his father's crew, running numbers and moving product with the same easy competence he brought to kneading dough at 4 in the morning to help his uncle before his shift. And Elena had loved, above almost everything else about him, the fact that he seemed to carry 2 entirely separate lives inside himself without letting either one curdle the other. The violence of his family's business and the flour-dusted gentleness of his hands, coexisting without apparent contradiction. "You could leave," he told her once, lying in the narrow bed above the bakery, with her head on his chest, the smell of yeast rising up through the floorboards from the ovens below. "We could go somewhere neither family has ever heard of. Phoenix, Denver, someplace with no docks and no bakeries and no fathers who think they own us." "You say that every time," she said, "and every time we're still here in the morning." "One of these times I'll mean it enough to actually do it." She had believed him, mostly. She had let herself believe, in the particular reckless optimism of being 24 and in love with someone her family would never approve of, that theirs was a story that would eventually bend toward the ending the songs promised, rather than the one the ledgers demanded. She hadn't understood yet how thoroughly debts outlast romance in that world, how a father's mistake, made years before his daughter was even old enough to understand what her family did for a living, could reach forward through time and simply erase every plan 2 young people had made in a rented bed above a bakery. The night Vincent Russo came to her father's house, she had run to Marco not for comfort exactly, comfort would come later if it came at all, but because some animal part of her understood that this was the last night either of them would ever get to choose anything about their own lives, and she wanted, before the choosing ended, to make one final decision entirely her own. "Marry me instead," Marco said that night, only half joking, his hands framing her face in the dark of his room. "Right now, tonight. We drive to Indiana, we find some justice of the peace who doesn't ask questions, and by morning you're a Ferretti, and there's nothing your father or Vincent Russo or anyone else can do about it." "They'd kill you," Eleanor said. "You know they would. Dante Russo doesn't lose face over a debt. If I disappeared the night before my wedding, he'd burn down every building your family owns looking for me. And when he found us, he'd make an example. You know this, Marco. We both do." "So we just let it happen. We let them hand you to him like property. Like you're nothing but the interest on a loan." "I don't see another option," she said, and hated the truth of it more than she'd ever hated anything. "But I'm here tonight. That's still mine to give. Whatever happens after this, tonight is still ours." He had held her like a man memorizing something he knew he was about to lose, and she had let herself be memorized, let herself memorize him in turn. The particular warmth of his skin, the low murmur of his voice, reciting half-remembered fragments of the poetry his mother used to read him as a boy. The absolute, uncomplicated safety of being wanted by someone who had chosen her rather than been assigned her. She would carry the memory of that night for the rest of her life, regardless of what came after, and in the months ahead, locked in a beautiful house on Astor Street with a husband who wouldn't speak to her, she would return to it again and again. Not with regret, though she sometimes tried to manufacture the regret she thought she was supposed to feel, but with a kind of fierce private gratitude that at least one night of her adult life had belonged entirely to her own choosing. What she hadn't accounted for, what neither of them had accounted for in the desperate arithmetic of a single stolen night, was that love, unlike loyalty, doesn't always stay contained to the hours in which it's expressed. It has a way of continuing to exist in the world after the two people who made it have been separated by forces greater than either of them, taking up residence in places neither of them intended, waiting to announce itself on its own schedule rather than theirs. 3 days after that night, she married Dante Russo in a church full of flowers neither she nor Marco had chosen. 11 weeks after that, alone in a bathroom in a house she hadn't chosen either, she watched 2 pink lines resolve into a truth that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of what she decided to do about it. That the debt her father owed one man had been paid in full by the body of a woman who now carried inside her the proof of a love the debt had never actually managed to erase. Marco did not know yet that he had left something behind that night beyond the memory of it. Elena would have to decide in the weeks before her husband returned from his war whether he ever would. Dante Russo came home on a Tuesday in late October, unannounced, at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing Elena heard was Rosa's small gasp from the front hall, and the first thing she felt was her own heart trying to climb up out of her chest. She had rehearsed this moment 100 different ways in the 3 months of his absence, had imagined confessing immediately, had imagined saying nothing at all and letting the growing evidence of her body speak for her, had imagined running, though she knew with total clarity there was nowhere in this city or any other where a Russo wife could disappear without being found. In the end, standing at the top of the stairs in a loose dress that did nothing to hide the small but undeniable curve that had appeared over the last several weeks. She simply watched him walk through the front door and felt every rehearsed version of this scene abandon her at once. He looked different than she remembered, leaner, harder, a new scar bisecting his jaw that hadn't been there at the wedding, his eyes carrying the particular exhausted weight of a man who had spent 3 months making decisions that cost other men their lives. For one unguarded second, looking up and seeing her at the top of the stairs, something in his face opened. Relief, she thought, or something close to it, an expression she wouldn't have believed him capable of if she hadn't seen it flicker and then vanish in the space of a single breath. Then his eyes moved down to the curve of her body beneath the dress, and everything in his face closed like a door slamming in a high wind. The silence that followed lasted so long that Rosa, visibly uncomfortable, excused herself toward the kitchen with a murmured excuse about supper, leaving husband and wife alone in the front hall, with 3 months and one impossible fact stretched taut between them. "How far along?" Dante said finally. His voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, in a specific way she now understood meant he was holding something enormous in check. "Almost 3 months. She watched him do the arithmetic, watched it land, watched his jaw work once before he mastered it. "The wedding night," he said. "I was gone the entire wedding night. We have never—" He stopped himself, and something raw broke briefly through the control, quickly suppressed. "Whose is it, Elena?" There was no version of this conversation where she could lie to him. Not really. The math was too simple, the timeline too exposed, and some part of her, exhausted after 3 months of silence and abandonment, found she didn't even want to try. "His name is Marco," she said. "Marco Ferretti. We were together before the marriage. The night before, actually. The last night before Vincent Russo came to collect me. I didn't know then. I didn't know until 9 weeks into this marriage, alone in a house you barely visited, that I was carrying his child." She had expected fury. She had, in her worst imaginings, expected violence, had heard enough about men like Dante Russo, about honor and blood, and the particular unforgiveness of a world that valued lineage above almost everything else, to expect that this confession might be the last thing she ever said to him as a free woman, or possibly the last thing she ever said at all. What she got instead was worse in its way. A long, terrible silence, during which Dante Russo simply looked at her, not with hatred, she realized slowly, but with something that looked almost like grief, the expression of a man watching a structure he had spent months quietly building collapse in real time in front of him. "Ferretti," he said finally, "the son of Enzo Ferretti. A crew that runs numbers on the near south side and thinks itself important enough to court a Marchetti daughter behind her father's back." "Don't," Elena said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. "Don't you dare reduce him to a line item. He loved me before your family ever decided I was worth anything to you. He still does, as far as I know. What we did before I belonged to anyone else. I won't apologize for a night that happened before I ever said your name in a church." "You belong to the Russo name now," Dante said, and his voice had gone flat and dangerous in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even in the kitchen with blood on his collar. "Whatever happened before that ring went on your finger is irrelevant to what happens now that it has. Do you understand what this means, Eleanor? Do you understand what it looks like to every family in this city if it becomes known that Dante Russo's wife is carrying another man's child 3 months into their marriage? I didn't marry you for love. I told you that on our wedding night. This was architecture, alliance, strategy. But even a marriage of convenience has terms, and those terms did not include you delivering a rival's child into my house for me to raise as my own. I never asked you to raise it as your own, Elena said, tears finally breaking through the composure she'd been holding since she heard the front door. I never asked you for anything, Dante. You left me alone on my wedding night without a word of explanation and disappeared for 3 months into a war I wasn't allowed to know anything about. You built me a beautiful cage and hired a woman to be kind to me inside it and called that a marriage. What did you expect to happen, leaving a person that alone for that long? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Somewhere in the kitchen, Rosa was pretending very hard not to be listening, the clatter of pans a fraction too loud, too deliberate. I expected you to wait, Dante said finally, quietly, and there was something in the admission that sounded almost like the truth cracking open beneath everything else. I know that isn't fair. I know I gave you every reason not to. But I expected it anyway, and finding out I was wrong. He stopped himself again, visibly reining in something he hadn't intended to say at all. Finding out you were wrong. What? Elena pressed, something in her desperate to hear the rest of that sentence. But he had already recovered himself, the mask sliding back into place with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning never to let anyone see him unguarded twice in the same conversation. I need to think, he said instead, about what this means, about what has to happen next. Stay in the house, Elena. I'll send word when I've decided. He left the way he always left, abruptly, without warning, the front door closing behind him with a finality that made the whole house seem to hold its breath. Elena sat down on the bottom stair, both hands pressed to the small, undeniable curve of her stomach, and understood that whatever came next, she had just handed Dante Russo the single greatest weapon anyone had ever held against her. And there was nothing left to do now but wait and see what he decided to do with it. He did not decide quickly. 3 days passed in which Dante did not return to the house, and Elena heard nothing except through Rosa, who reported in a careful, sideways manner, never quite saying she'd overheard anything, though it was clear she had, that Mr. Russo had been closeted with his uncle and his capos at the family's offices on Rush Street from morning until well past midnight each day. On the 4th day, Vincent Russo came to the house alone. He found Elena in the walled garden behind the townhouse, sitting on the stone bench beneath the bare autumn trees with a shawl around her shoulders, and he sat down across from her on the garden's second bench, with none of his usual composed detachment. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked, if not sympathetic, at least genuinely troubled. "You understand the position you've put my nephew in," he said without preamble. "I understand the position I was put in by 2 families who traded me like currency," Elena said. "I understand it very well, Vincent. I'd like to hear the position I've put Dante in, though, if you're determined to lecture me about it." Vincent's mouth twitched, something that might have been reluctant respect. A man in Dante's position cannot be seen to raise another man's child as his heir, not because he lacks the heart for it. My nephew has more heart than he lets anyone see, more than is good for him in this line of work, frankly, but because the entire architecture of respect he commands depends on an appearance of absolute control. If it becomes known that his wife carried a rival's child within months of their marriage, and he simply absorbed it, folded it into his household as though nothing had happened, every man who currently fears crossing him will begin, quietly, to wonder what else he might absorb without consequence. Respect in our world is built on the belief that offences against a man's honour are always answered. An unanswered offence is read as weakness, and weakness gets men killed, Elena. Not metaphorically, actually. So what is he going to do? Answer the offence? That is what he's deciding, Vincent said. There are precedents. Some men in his position would set the wife aside entirely, annul the marriage, return her to her father's house in disgrace, and consider the debt paid in a different currency, humiliation rather than blood. It would satisfy honour without requiring violence. It is, in fact, the option I have been advising. Elena's hands went cold in her lap. And the child? The child would go with you. Ferretti's problem, if he wants it, or your father's, if Ferretti doesn't. Vincent's eyes, when they met hers, held something that surprised her. Not cruelty, but a kind of weary pity. I want to be honest with you, Elena, because I think you deserve at least that much after everything my family has put you through. I've told my nephew this is the sensible path. It protects him, it protects the alliance with your father, and it doesn't ask him to swallow something no man in his position should reasonably be asked to swallow. And what does he say to that? For the first time, Vincent looked almost baffled, an expression so foreign to his usual composure that Elena found herself leaning forward despite everything. He says no, Vincent admitted, which is, I will tell you honestly, the single most surprising thing my nephew has done since he took over this family 8 years ago. Dante Russo does not sentiment his way through decisions, Elena. He has built an empire specifically by never letting sentiment override strategy. And yet here we are, 4 days of arguing, and he will not agree to set you aside, though I have laid out every rational argument available to me. Elena felt something shift in her chest, something she immediately distrusted, some dangerous flicker of hope she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Why not? I don't know, Vincent said, and for once he sounded entirely truthful. I genuinely don't know. And it troubles me more than I can say, because a man like my nephew, who starts making decisions he can't fully explain, is a man who has stopped being entirely predictable. And in our world, predictability is safety. I came here today, in fact, partly to ask you the same question. What did you say to him that day he came home? What is it about you that's making Dante Russo walk away from the smartest move available to him? I don't know either, Elena said honestly. I told him the truth, that's all. I didn't beg him for anything. Vincent studied her for a long moment, something calculating returning to his eyes, though gentler now than she'd seen it before. Perhaps that's precisely it, he said finally. Every woman in his life who has ever wanted something from him has known exactly how to ask for it, softly, strategically, with an eye toward what he could give them. You simply told him the truth and asked him for nothing at all. I imagine that's rarer, in his experience, than you realize. He left without telling her what Dante had ultimately decided, and Elena sat alone in the garden long after he'd gone, turning Vincent's words over and over, understanding, with a clarity that frightened her more than any threat could have, that somewhere in the last 4 days, without either of them intending it, this marriage had stopped being simple architecture and become something far more dangerous, a question neither of them yet knew how to answer, with a child's life, and possibly her own, hanging in the balance of whatever answer Dante Russo finally settled on. That night, for the first time in 3 months, he came to her. He found her in the small library on the second floor, curled in the window seat, with a book she hadn't actually been reading, the last of the evening light draining slowly out of the sky beyond the glass. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him, and when she finally looked up and saw him there, tired, jacket discarded somewhere, sleeves rolled to his forearms in a way that made him look, briefly, less like a kingpin and more like an ordinary exhausted man, something in her chest tightened involuntarily. "Vincent came to see you," he said, not a question. "He told me my options, set aside, in disgrace, or—" She stopped. "He didn't tell me the other option, only that you'd refused the first one." Dante crossed the room slowly and sat not beside her, but in the armchair across from the window seat, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the particular stillness of a man holding himself very carefully in check. "I've spent 4 days trying to find the version of this that protects everyone," he said. "My family's honor, your safety, the child's future. I have not found it yet. Every path I map out sacrifices one of the 3. "You could let me go," she said quietly. "Set me aside. Vincent said it would satisfy honor without violence. I could take the child and go somewhere none of this could follow us." "There is nowhere in this city, or the next 3 states over, that a Russo scandal doesn't follow," Dante said. "You understand that even now, don't you? If I set you aside, every rival family in Chicago will read it as an opening. Proof that I can be humiliated and simply absorb it rather than answer for it in blood. Half of them would come after your father again within the year, and the other half would come after you and the child directly, simply to see whether I'd respond. Setting you aside doesn't protect you, Elena. It exposes you completely, the moment you're no longer under Russo protection." "So I'm trapped either way?" "Yes," he said, with a bluntness that felt, oddly, more respectful than any softer answer would have been. "I won't pretend otherwise to you. You are trapped, and it isn't fair, and none of it is your fault in any way that matters. Your father incurred a debt before you were old enough to understand what your family did for a living. I demanded a marriage to settle it, without asking whether you wanted any part of the life it would drag you into. And now you're carrying a child conceived before either of those decisions was made, and somehow you're the one being asked to pay for all of it. I am aware of the injustice of that, Elena, even if I don't know yet how to undo it." She hadn't expected honesty like this from him, hadn't expected him to name the unfairness of her position so plainly, without excuse or softening. It disarmed her more than any apology could have. "Then what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, rougher, carrying something she hadn't heard from him before, not the flat control of the Mafia Boss, but something closer to the man underneath it. "I'm going to keep you," he said. "Both of you. Publicly, as my wife, and, God help me, as the child's father, in every way that matters to the world outside these walls. I will not annul this marriage, and I will not let anyone in this city treat you or the child as anything other than under Russo protection, permanently and completely." Elena stared at him. "Why? You just told me what it costs you. Half your empire's respect, you said." "I know what I said." His jaw tightened. "I've spent 4 days telling myself all the reasons I shouldn't do this, that it's strategically indefensible, that Vincent is right, that setting you aside is the smarter, safer, more survivable path. I have not been able to make myself choose it, and I've had to sit with the fact that for the first time in 8 years of running this family, I am making a decision I cannot fully justify to the men who depend on me to always have a reason." "And why?" she said again, quieter now, something in his face making the question feel less like an argument and more like something she genuinely needed answered. He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite vulnerability, he didn't seem built for that exactly, but something close enough to it that she felt her breath catch, waiting for the rest of it. "Because the wedding night," he said finally, low and rough, "when I left you alone in that hotel, I told myself it was necessary. The war demanded it, and it was true, it was necessary. But I have thought about that night more than I've thought about almost anything else in the 3 months since, and not because of the war. Because I left a woman I had just made vows to, alone, on the single night she most needed someone to at least explain themselves to her. And I did it without a second thought, because I had trained myself for 8 years not to let anyone matter enough to interrupt my priorities. And then I came home today and found out you'd spent those same 3 months carrying another man's child. And my first instinct, before the strategy, before the honor, before any of it, was simply grief, Elena. Grief that I'd wasted the only months I had to actually become someone you might have chosen if things had been different. I don't have the right to feel that. I know I don't. But I do. And I can't seem to talk myself out of it, and it's the only honest answer I have for why I won't let you go." The silence that followed felt enormous, charged with something neither of them seemed prepared to name. Elena felt tears rising, unbidden, and didn't try to stop them this time. "That isn't strategy," she said finally, softly. "That sounds like something else entirely." "I'm aware," Dante said, and for the first time since she'd met him, something that might almost have been a smile, rueful, unguarded, touched the corner of his mouth. "It's inconvenient. I'd ask you not to mention it to my uncle." Despite everything, despite 3 months of silence and abandonment, despite the impossible tangle they were both now caught in, Elena found herself, unexpectedly, almost smiling back. Word of Dante's decision reached the wider Russo organization within a week, and the reaction split, predictably, along lines of loyalty and fear. The younger capos, men who had come up under Dante and owed their positions and their lives to his particular brand of ruthless competence, mostly held their tongues in public and reserved their doubts for private conversations Elena wasn't meant to overhear, but occasionally did anyway, drifting past half-open doors in the Rush Street offices where Rosa sometimes brought her, for reasons Elena suspected had less to do with errands than with Dante quietly wanting her seen, present, established as unmistakably his. The older men were less careful. She was in the hallway outside Vincent's office, waiting for Dante to finish a meeting, when she heard Salvatore Greco's voice, an old capo who had served Dante's father before him, a man built like a retired boxer, with a voice that carried through walls out of sheer habit rather than any effort to be discreet. "He's making himself a joke, Vincent. You know it, I know it. Half the men on the docks are already saying it, that Dante Russo let a Ferretti brat into his house and called it honour. You want to tell me how long it takes before somebody tests that? Before some junior nobody in the Sartori crew decides Dante's gone soft and takes a shot at finding out?" "My nephew is aware of the risk," Vincent said, his voice carrying the particular patience of a man who had already had this argument several times and was tired of repeating himself. "He has made his decision. Your job, Sal, and mine, is to make sure the men fall in line behind it, not to keep relitigating whether it was the right one." "My job is to keep him alive," Greco snapped. "And a boss the men don't fully respect anymore is a boss who gets killed by his own people before any rival even has to lift a finger. You've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. Respect is the only currency that actually matters in this business. And Dante's spending his awfully fast on a woman he barely knows." Eleanor stepped back from the door before either man noticed her, her heart hammering, and found Aldo waiting a little further down the hall, his expression carefully neutral in the way she'd come to recognize as his particular skill. The ability to have heard everything and to reveal absolutely nothing about what he thought of it. "Is it true?" she asked him quietly, once they were out of easy earshot. "What Greco said? Are the men really losing respect for him because of me?" Aldo considered the question with more care than she expected. "Some of them, maybe," he admitted finally. "The old guard especially. Men who came up believing honour only ever looks one way. But you should know something else too, Mrs. Russo, if it helps any. There's another kind of respect building right alongside the doubt. Men who watch Mr. Russo make a hard call and stick with it anyway, even when it costs him. Some of them start to trust him more for it, not less. A boss who only ever does the safe thing is predictable, sure, but predictable men get outmaneuvered eventually too. A boss willing to absorb real cost for something he believes in, that's harder to plan against, harder to buy off. I've seen men switch loyalty over less." It was, Elena thought, the longest speech she'd ever heard Aldo give, and she filed it away carefully, grateful for whatever scrap of reassurance it offered against the churning anxiety Greco's words had left behind. That night, Dante called a formal council, the first Elena had ever been permitted to witness any part of, standing at the back of the room at his own insistence, while a dozen of the family's senior men gathered around the long table in the Rush Street offices. She understood, watching him take his seat at the head of that table, that this was as much theatre as decision-making. Dante needed his men to see him claim this choice openly, without apology, in front of the people whose loyalty depended on believing he never made a decision he couldn't defend. "I know what's being said," he began, without preamble, his voice carrying the same flat, absolute authority she remembered from their wedding, though something in it now felt less performed than it once had. "That I've gone soft, that I'm protecting a woman and a child that aren't mine out of sentiment rather than sense. I want to be direct with every man in this room. I am not asking for your understanding, and I am not interested in debating the decision further. My wife remains my wife. The child she carries will be raised under Rousseau protection, will bear the Rousseau name, and will be treated by every man in this organization with the same respect owed to any child of mine. Anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to bring it to me directly, rather than muttering about it in hallways where they think I can't hear them. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena watched Greco's jaw work, watched him decide, visibly, not to be the man who tested that invitation in front of the entire table. "Some of you are wondering what this costs us," Dante continued. "So let me be equally direct about that. It costs us the appearance of a certain kind of strength, the kind that comes from never bending, never absorbing an insult, always answering every offence in blood. I am telling you, as the man who has kept this family at the top of this city for 8 years, that this is not the only kind of strength that matters. A family that survives by rigid, unbending honour eventually breaks, because the world doesn't stay still long enough to reward men who refuse to adapt to it. I am adapting. I expect every man in this room to adapt alongside me, or to find another family whose rules suit him better. That door is open tonight. It will not stay open indefinitely." No one moved. No one spoke. And when the meeting ended and the men filed out, Elena caught in more than one face something that looked less like doubt now and more like the particular respect Aldo had described, grudging maybe, uncertain in places, but real. Dante found her afterward in the hallway, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You didn't have to do that in front of everyone," she said finally. "You could have simply told them privately." "They needed to see it," he said, "not hear about it second-hand. A decision like this only holds if I make it in the open, where every man in that room can watch me stand behind it." He studied her for a moment, something unguarded flickering across his face again, the way it had in the library. "You looked frightened, standing back there." "I was," she admitted. "Greco's not wrong that some of them hate this." "Some of them do," Dante agreed. "But you're not alone in this house anymore, Elena. Whatever this marriage started as, it isn't ending as architecture. I need you to understand that, whatever else happens between us." She didn't have an answer for that yet, didn't fully trust the warmth spreading through her chest at his words, given everything that had come before. But she found, walking beside him back toward the car, that for the first time since her father's kitchen 4 months ago, she didn't feel entirely alone in whatever came next. The weeks that followed settled into something Elena hadn't expected to find inside a marriage built from debt and scandal. A kind of fragile, careful domesticity. Dante began coming home most evenings, arriving at the Astor Street townhouse by 7 or 8 most nights, shedding his jacket in the front hall with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent all day holding an empire together through sheer force of will. He didn't talk about business, still. That boundary remained fixed, unmovable, a wall Elena had stopped testing after the first few attempts made clear it wasn't about to fall. But he began, in small and almost imperceptible ways, to let her see other pieces of himself. She learned he read poetry, of all things, found him one evening in the library with a battered, much-read copy of Neruda, and watched him flush, actually flush, embarrassed at being caught with it, before admitting his mother had loved it, and he'd never been able to give away her copy after she died. "You don't strike me as a man who reads love poetry," she said, settling into the window seat across from him, careful not to make too much of the moment and risk him closing off again. "I'm not, generally," he admitted. "But some nights the only voice that makes any sense of what I do all day is a man writing about a woman's hands. It's not something I advertise. I won't tell Greco. That earned her, unexpectedly, a real laugh, low, surprised out of him, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, but real. She found herself thinking about it for days afterward. The particular warmth of having made Dante Russo laugh, however briefly, however small the victory. He asked about the baby, too, in ways that surprised her with their specificity. Whether she'd seen a doctor, whether the nausea had passed, whether she wanted a boy or a girl, though he always asked these questions carefully, almost formally, as if testing whether he had the right to ask them at all. You don't have to pretend interest, she told him once, midway through her 5th month, when he'd asked, apropos of nothing over dinner, whether she'd felt the baby move yet. I know the situation is complicated for you. Something shuttered briefly behind his eyes. Is that what you think this is? Pretending? I don't know what to think, Dante. You've been generous, kinder than I had any right to expect given everything. But I also know what this child represents to your family's honor, and I don't want you performing warmth toward it if it isn't real. He set down his fork very carefully, and when he looked at her, his expression had gone serious in a way she'd learned to pay attention to. I made a decision in front of my entire organization that this child would be raised under Russo protection, with Russo respect, in every way a child of my own blood would be. I do not make promises like that lightly, Elena, and I do not perform them once made. Whatever else is complicated between us, and God knows plenty is, that particular commitment isn't one of them. When the baby moves, I want to know. Not because it's politically useful for me to appear invested, because I find that I actually am. She hadn't expected the sincerity of that answer to undo her quite as thoroughly as it did. She found herself later that night lying awake in the dark of her own room. They still kept separate rooms, another boundary neither of them had tested yet. Turning his words over and over, trying to understand what it meant that a man who had left her alone on her wedding night without explanation was now the same man asking, with genuine care in his voice, whether her body had yet begun to signal the presence of a child that wasn't even his. It was during this fragile season of uneasy peace that jealousy first entered the marriage. Though not from the direction Elena expected. They attended a Russo family function at the end of her 6th month, a charity gala at the Drake, ostensibly benefiting a children's hospital, actually functioning, as most such events did in that world, as a chance for the city's power brokers to see and be seen and quietly assess each other's current standing. Elena, uncomfortable in her changing body and unused to functioning as a public Russo wife, found herself cornered near the bar by a woman she didn't recognize, beautiful, poised, dressed in a red gown that made no secret of its intentions, who introduced herself as Camilla Vitale and mentioned with a lightness Elena instantly distrusted that she and Dante went back a very long way before all this. Before all this being, Elena said carefully, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, without quite meaning to. His marriage? His marriage, his empire, all of it, Camilla said, smiling in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Dante and I were involved for nearly 2 years before you. It ended, of course, the way these things always end for men like him. He decided the alliance value of a marriage mattered more than whatever he felt for me. I imagine you understand that particular arithmetic better than most, given how you came into the family yourself. Elena felt something sharp and unfamiliar rise in her chest, not hurt exactly, though there was some of that too, but a fierce, possessive anger that startled her with its intensity. "If you're hoping to unsettle me," she said, surprising herself with her own steadiness, "I should tell you it isn't working the way you'd like. Whatever Dante felt for you belongs to a version of him I never met. I'm not particularly interested in relitigating his past." "How generous of you," Camilla said, though something in her smile had thinned. "I wonder if you'll feel so generous when you see how he still looks at me." She didn't get the chance to find out. Dante appeared at Elena's side within moments, his hand settling at the small of her back with a possessiveness that felt, for the first time since the wedding, entirely unguarded, and his eyes, when they found Camilla's, carried none of the warmth she'd apparently been hoping to provoke. "Camilla," he said, his voice courteous and utterly, deliberately cold. "I don't believe my wife required company at the bar." "I was only being friendly, Dante, catching up on old times." "There are no old times worth catching up on," he said, and something in his tone made even Camilla's polish falter briefly. "I'd ask you not to seek out my wife again at these functions. She has enough to manage without old business interrupting her evening." He steered Elena away with a firm hand, and it was only once they were alone near the terrace doors, the noise of the gala muffled behind them, that she let herself ask the question burning in her chest. "Was she telling the truth about the two of you?" "We were involved, yes. Before the marriage. It ended before Vincent ever came to your father's house. It had nothing to do with you." He studied her face carefully. "Does it trouble you?" "I don't know why it should," Elena said honestly. "This isn't that kind of marriage. Or it wasn't supposed to be." Something moved behind his eyes, dark and unreadable. "And now?" She didn't answer because she genuinely didn't know how to, and the honesty of that silence seemed to satisfy him more than any answer could have. He didn't let go of her hand for the rest of the evening, and when Camilla watched them from across the ballroom, with an expression Elena chose not to examine too closely, she found she didn't mind being watched, nearly as much as she once might have. 3 weeks later, in her 7th month, Elena discovered exactly how far Dante's possessiveness could extend when someone else's did the provoking. Aldo drove her, at her own insistence, to Alto, a nightclub the Russo family owned outright on the near north side, a gleaming, velvet-dark establishment that functioned as a kind of neutral territory where rival families conducted quiet business under the pretense of nightlife. Elena had wanted only to meet Rosa's niece, a young woman named Bianca, who worked the coat check and had, over months of small kindnesses, become something like a friend, one of the very few people in Elena's new life who treated her as simply a person rather than a Russo asset to be managed. She hadn't expected Marco to be there. She saw him before he saw her, recognized the set of his shoulders across the crowded floor before she recognized his face, and felt her whole body go rigid with a shock that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the sudden, vertiginous collision of two entirely separate lives she had never expected to occupy the same room again. He was with 2 other men she didn't recognize, Ferretti crew by the look of them, and when his eyes found hers across the club, she watched every trace of colour drain from his face. He crossed the floor before she could decide whether to flee, and up close she could see how much the last 7 months had changed him too. thinner, harder around the eyes, a man who had clearly spent this pregnancy in a very different kind of silence than she had. Elena. His voice cracked slightly on her name. God, I heard. Everyone's heard by now what happened. That you're... His eyes dropped involuntarily to the unmistakable curve beneath her dress, and something raw and complicated moved across his face. Is it? Yes, she said quietly, before he could finish the question in a room full of people who absolutely could not overhear the answer to it. Marco, you can't be here. If anyone sees us talking... I don't care who sees, he said, and there was a recklessness in his voice that frightened her more than anything Dante had ever said or done. I've spent 7 months hearing that you were locked in some Russo mansion, that he'd abandoned you, that he might set you aside in disgrace. I didn't know if you were even safe, Elena. I didn't know if the baby... The baby is fine. I'm fine. She glanced desperately around the club, and it was in that moment that she saw Dante, arriving apparently for reasons of his own business, stopping dead near the entrance as his eyes found her standing close, too close, to a man he clearly recognized on sight. What happened next unfolded with the terrible, silent speed of a car accident. Dante crossed the floor in a handful of strides, and though his face betrayed almost nothing to the crowded room around them, Elena had spent enough months learning the language of his stillness to recognize the fury contained beneath it. Ferretti, he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried an edge that made the 2 nearby men at Marco's table go very still. I don't recall extending an invitation to my club, tonight or any other night. I'm not here for you, Russo, Marco said, and Elena felt her stomach drop at the challenge in his voice, a young man's recklessness unweighed by the 8 years of consequence Dante had spent building his empire. I'm here because I heard my child's mother was pregnant and alone, and no one would tell me whether she was even safe. The word landed in the space between the 3 of them like a dropped glass. My child. Elena watched something in Dante's face go utterly, dangerously still. Careful, Dante said very quietly, about what you claim in a room full of my men, Ferretti. That word carries weight you may not be prepared to pay for. I'll pay whatever it costs to know she's safe, Marco said. You want to threaten me over it, go ahead. I've spent 7 months imagining every possible thing that might have happened to her in your house, and no one from your family had the decency to tell either of us anything. Elena stepped between them before either man could do something the whole club would remember for years. Stop! Both of you. This isn't the place, and it certainly isn't the way. She turned to Marco, her voice low and urgent. I need you to leave, Marco. Please. Not because I don't understand why you're angry, but because nothing good comes from this happening here, in front of everyone. Something in her tone finally seemed to reach him. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he used to, back before either of their lives had been rearranged by men with more power than either of them, and some of the fury drained slowly out of his face, replaced by something sadder, more resigned. Is he good to you? He asked, quietly enough now that only she and Dante could hear it. Tell me honestly, Elena. Whatever else is true, tell me that much. She felt Dante go very still beside her, waiting, she realized, for her answer with an intensity that surprised her. He is, she said finally, and meant it more than she expected to when the words left her mouth. It isn't simple. Nothing about any of this is simple. But he's been good to me, Marco. And to the baby. I need you to believe that, and let this go, for all our sakes. Marco held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharply, and turned to go, though he paused at the edge of the crowd and looked back at Dante with something that wasn't quite deference, but wasn't quite defiance either. "If I ever hear otherwise," he said, "I won't be as careful next time about where I say it." Dante didn't respond to the threat at all, and something about his silence, the fact that he let Marco walk away without answering the challenge, told Elena more about the state of things between them than any argument could have. They didn't speak until they were in the car, Aldo driving them home through streets slick with early winter rain, and it was Dante who finally broke the silence, his voice low and rough in the dark of the back seat. "You told him I was good to you." "You are," Elena said simply. "I could have killed him tonight," Dante said, and there was no theatre in it, only a flat, exhausted honesty. "Every instinct I've spent 8 years training told me to. A man claims another man's wife's child in front of my own men in my own club. The old rules say I answer that in blood, immediately, publicly, or I lose every ounce of respect I've spent this whole marriage trying to hold on to. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the window rather than looking at her. "Because you asked me not to," he said finally. "Because somewhere in the last 7 months, what you ask of me has started to matter more than what the old rules demand. I don't entirely know what to do with that fact, Helena. It terrifies me considerably more than any war with the Sartoris ever did." She reached, without entirely deciding to, and found his hand in the dark of the car, and he let her take it, his fingers closing slowly around hers, with a gentleness that felt, after everything, like the truest thing that had passed between them since the wedding. The Sartori War had ended, officially, in a truce brokered the same week Dante returned home to find Elena pregnant, a truce that had held, mostly, through the autumn and into the depths of winter, punctuated by the kind of uneasy quiet that everyone in that world knew never really meant peace, only a pause between one round of violence and the next. It broke, finally, in the 8th month of Elena's pregnancy, and it broke through her. She was returning from a doctor's appointment, with Aldo driving, the two of them alone in the car on a grey afternoon in late January, when a black sedan pulled alongside them on Lakeshore Drive, and the passenger window rolled down to reveal the barrel of a gun. Aldo reacted before Elena's mind had even finished processing the shape of the threat, swerving hard, throwing the car into a skid that threw Elena against her seatbelt with enough force to knock the breath out of her, gunning the engine down a side street with a speed that made her cry out, one hand instinctively pressed to her stomach, as if she could shield the child inside her through sheer force of will. 2 shots cracked against the car's rear panel before Aldo lost the sedan in a maze of alleys behind the old produce warehouses, and by the time he finally pulled over, both of them shaking, Elena was crying in the passenger seat with a terror that went beyond anything she'd felt, even on her wedding night. "Are you hurt?" Aldo's voice was rougher than she'd ever heard it, his own hands visibly unsteady on the wheel. "Mrs. Russo, are you hit anywhere? Is the baby—" "I'm fine," Elena managed, though her whole body was shaking. I think we're both fine. Aldo, who was that? Was that the Sartoris?" "I don't know," he said grimly, already reaching for his phone. "But Mr. Russo needs to know about this before he hears it from anyone else. Dante arrived at the townhouse before Eleanor had even finished changing out of her torn stockings, moving through the front door with a controlled violence in his stride that made Rosa flatten herself instinctively against the hallway wall. He found Eleanor in the sitting room, wrapped in a blanket, still shaking, and the expression on his face when he saw her, genuine, unguarded fear, the first time she'd seen it so nakedly on him, undid something in her chest that she'd been holding carefully closed since the moment the gun had appeared in that car window. "Tell me everything," he said, kneeling in front of her chair, his hands finding hers with a desperation that had nothing careful or calculated about it at all. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out," she told him haltingly, her voice breaking in places, and watched his face harden with each detail, watched something cold and absolute settle behind his eyes that she recognized with a chill as the same expression Vincent had described in her father's kitchen months ago, the look of a man calculating exactly how much blood a particular offence required. "It was the Sartoris," he said once she'd finished. "It has to be. No one else would risk hitting a Russo car on Lakeshore Drive in broad daylight unless they were trying to send the message that superseded every rule of caution." "What message?" "That they know you're carrying a child," Dante said grimly. "That they understand exactly how much that child means to my standing with my own men, and that they intend to use it against me, either by killing you both and forcing me into a war I can't avoid, or by threatening you specifically to extract concessions I'd otherwise never grant." His jaw tightened, and for a moment the mask cracked entirely, revealing something raw and furious beneath it. "I should never have let you leave this house without 4 men instead of 1. I should have anticipated this the moment the Sartorias realized what your pregnancy meant to my position." "You couldn't have known." "I should have known," he said, with a bitterness that surprised her. "I have spent 8 years anticipating exactly this kind of move from exactly this kind of enemy, and I let myself become distracted by everything that's happened between us these past months, and it nearly cost you your life today. I won't make that mistake again." What followed was a transformation in the household that Elena hadn't anticipated. Dante doubled the security around the townhouse within hours, additional men stationed at every entrance, the walled garden fitted with cameras she hadn't noticed being installed, Aldo joined by 2 more soldiers whose sole job, she understood without being told, was to ensure nothing like today's attack ever came within a mile of succeeding again. Dante himself began coming home earlier, staying closer, in a way that felt less like the careful, tentative domesticity of the previous months, and more like a man standing guard over something he had only just realized he could not survive losing. "You don't have to hover," she told him one evening, a week after the attack, finding him in the doorway of her room for the 3rd time that night, checking, she understood, simply to see that she was still there, still breathing, still safe. "I'm not going to disappear if you look away for 5 minutes." "I know that," he said, though he didn't move from the doorway. "Logically, I know that. It doesn't seem to matter to whatever part of me keeps needing to check, anyway." She studied him for a long moment, this man who had left her alone on her wedding night without a word of explanation, who now couldn't seem to walk past her door without needing proof of her continued existence, and felt something in her chest shift, quietly, into a shape she hadn't let herself examine too closely until now. "Come in, then," she said. "If you're only going to hover in the doorway all night anyway, you might as well hover somewhere with a chair." He hesitated only a moment before crossing the threshold and settled into the armchair by her window with the particular careful stillness of a man unused to being invited rather than merely tolerated. And they sat together in silence for a long while, the winter dark pressing against the glass, both of them aware, without either saying it aloud, that whatever this marriage had started as, it had become something neither of them was any longer prepared to lose. It was Vincent, in the end, who told her the thing that changed everything. Not out of malice, she would understand later, but out of the particular, exhausted honesty of an old man who had spent too many years managing other people's secrets and had finally grown tired of carrying one that wasn't strictly his to keep. He came to the townhouse alone, 10 days after the attempt on Elena's life, while Dante was at the Rush Street offices coordinating the retaliation Elena understood, without being told directly, was already being planned against the Sartori family. Vincent found her in the garden, despite the cold, wrapped in a heavy coat, unable to bear the walls of the house any longer after the week she'd had, and he sat down across from her with none of his usual composed formality. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that my nephew doesn't know I'm about to tell you, and that he may be furious with me for revealing. I've decided I don't particularly care anymore. You deserve to understand what actually happened on your wedding night, Elena, rather than the version you've apparently been left to assume." Elena went very still. "What do you mean, the version I've assumed?" "You believe Dante left you alone that night purely because of the war with the Sartoris," Vincent said. "That much is true, as far as it goes. But it isn't the whole truth, and I think it's time someone gave you the rest of it." He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "The war that night wasn't simply defensive, Elena. My nephew received intelligence the afternoon of your wedding that the Sartoris intended to use the wedding itself as an opportunity, that they'd identified the reception as the single moment when every senior Russo capo, including Dante, would be gathered in one place, vulnerable, distracted by celebration. He left you that night not merely to fight a war, but because he had received word of a planned attack on the reception itself, one he spent that entire night working to intercept and dismantle before it could be executed." Elena felt the ground shift beneath the story she'd been carrying for months. "He never told me that." "He wouldn't have," Vincent said. "Dante has never been a man who explains himself, even when the explanation would serve him. He decided that night that telling you the reception itself had nearly been the site of a massacre would only terrify you further, on top of everything else you were already being asked to absorb. He judged, perhaps wrongly, I've told him as much, that leaving you in ignorant safety was kinder than leaving you in informed terror. He has carried the guilt of that decision every day since, Elena, more than I think you've ever given him credit for. He believes, quite sincerely, that his silence that night is the reason you turned to someone else before he'd even had the chance to become someone worth staying faithful to. He blames himself for what happened with Marco Ferretti nearly as much as he has ever let on." Elena sat with this for a long moment, the cold forgotten, her mind reordering everything she thought she understood about the last 8 months. "Why are you telling me this now?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, his composure, for once, entirely genuine rather than performed. "Because I watched a car full of Sartori men try to kill you on Lakeshore Drive 10 days ago," he said finally. "And I watched my nephew's face when he arrived at this house afterward. And I have known Dante since he was a boy of 12, learning to bury his own father, Eleanor. I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you that day. I spent months advising him to set you aside, to protect the family's honor through the safest possible path, and I have come to believe I was wrong to do it. Whatever this marriage started as, it has become something I no longer believe either of you should try to escape. And I think you deserve to understand the man you're actually married to before you decide what you want to do about that. Why didn't he tell me himself? Because my nephew, Vincent said, with something that might almost have been fondness, has spent his entire adult life believing that vulnerability is a weakness no boss can afford to show, not even to his own wife. He would rather you believe he abandoned you for cold strategic reasons than admit he spent that entire night terrified of losing you before he'd even had the chance to know you. And terrified, too, of what it meant that the fear felt personal rather than merely tactical. I imagine he still hasn't fully admitted that to himself, let alone to you. Elena thought of the whiskey glass in the dark kitchen, 5 weeks into her isolation, the unguarded exhaustion she'd glimpsed on his face before he'd mastered it back into stillness. She thought of the poetry hidden in the library, the careful cataloguing of her preferences from a distance he hadn't trusted himself to close. She thought of his hand at her back in the ballroom, his cold fury at Camilla Vitale, his stillness in the car after the attack, the desperate way he'd knelt in front of her chair, asking her to tell him everything. She understood, sitting in that cold garden with Vincent Russo, watching her with unexpected gentleness, that she had spent 8 months mistaking a man's terror for indifference, mistaking his silence for coldness, when in fact she had married someone who had simply never learned any language for love except the language of control and protection, and who had, despite every instinct trained into him over a lifetime in that brutal world, been trying, however clumsily, to speak it to her anyway. "Does he know you're telling me this?" she asked again. "No," Vincent admitted, "and I'd ask that you not tell him I did, at least not immediately. Let him come to it himself, in his own time, if he's able to. But I wanted you to have the truth, Eleanor, whatever you decide to do with it. You've been carrying an unfair burden of assumption about a man who has, in his own broken way, been trying to earn something he never let himself believe he deserved to have." He left shortly afterwards, and Eleanor sat alone in the garden until the cold finally drove her inside, turning over 8 months of memory in an entirely new light, understanding for the first time that the debt she had been forced to pay might, after everything, have delivered her to something she had never expected to find on the other side of it. A man worth choosing, if she let herself, rather than merely a man she had been given no choice but to marry. She didn't tell him what Vincent had shared, not right away. Instead, she let it settle into her over the following days, watching Dante with new eyes, noticing things she had previously read as merely dutiful that now looked, in this new light, like something closer to devotion badly translated. The retaliation against the Sartoris came swiftly, and by all accounts Elena gathered second-hand through Rosa and Aldo's careful non-answers, decisively. 3 Sartori lieutenants found dead within a single week, a message so unambiguous that even the family's most aggressive remaining faction sent, through intermediaries, a tentative offer of renewed truce within 10 days. Dante did not discuss the details with Elena, but she noticed this time that his silence on the matter felt different than it once had, less like a wall built to keep her out, and more like a father shielding a child from violence he'd rather she never have to carry in her own memory. "You're different," she told him, one evening in early February, the two of them sharing the quiet ritual that had become, without either of them quite naming it, their nightly habit. Him in the armchair by her window, her curled in the window seat, some low music playing from the radio Rosa had brought up months ago, and neither of them had ever bothered turning off. Different how? Quieter. Not colder quiet, just like you're thinking about something you haven't decided whether to say. He was silent for a long moment, turning his glass of whiskey slowly in his hand, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "I keep thinking about the night we married," he said finally, "about what I should have told you, and didn't." Elena's breath caught. She said nothing, waiting. "I received word that afternoon that the Sartorius intended to hit the reception itself," he said, and she watched him force the words out with visible effort, a man unaccustomed to this particular kind of confession. Not simply a war somewhere else in the city, an attack on our own wedding. Time to catch every senior man in my organization in one undefended room. I left you that night because I spent it hunting down and dismantling that plan before it could be executed. And I never told you because I judged it kinder to let you believe I'd simply abandoned you for ordinary business than to let you know how close you came on your own wedding day to watching men die in front of you. "I know," Elena said quietly. He looked up sharply. "You know?" "Vincent told me. 10 days ago." She held his gaze, steady despite the sudden tension that had entered the room. "He said you'd never tell me yourself, that you'd rather I believed you cold than admit you'd been afraid." Something raw moved across his face, not quite anger, though there was some of that, aimed, she thought, more at Vincent's interference than at her knowing. "He had no right to tell you that." "Maybe not," she said, "but I'm glad he did, Dante, because I spent 8 months believing you left me that night out of nothing but cold calculation, and it was slowly poisoning everything I might otherwise have let myself feel for you. Knowing the truth doesn't erase what those months cost either of us, but it changes what I understand about the man I actually married. And I think that matters more than whether Vincent had the right to tell me." Dante set down his glass very carefully, and when he looked at her again, something in his expression had shifted into a kind of exposed honesty she had never seen from him before, not even in their most unguarded moments. "I have spent my entire life being taught that showing fear is the same as inviting death," he said. "My father died because a rival read weakness in him at exactly the wrong moment, and I was 12 years old when I buried him, and swore I would never make that same mistake. I built everything I am, every wall, every silence, every careful, controlled decision around that single conviction. And then I married a woman I was told to think of as strategy. And somewhere in 8 impossible months, she became the single thing in my life I am most afraid of losing. And I don't know how to hold both of those truths at once, without one of them destroying me." "You don't have to hold them apart," Elena said softly. "That's the part I don't think you've let yourself understand yet. Being afraid of losing someone isn't the same as being weak in front of your enemies. You can be terrified of what happens to me, to the baby, and still be the man who put 3 Sartori lieutenants in the ground within a week to protect us. Those aren't contradictions, Dante. They're the same thing, seen from 2 different angles." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and unguarded that she felt more than heard. "I don't know how to be the man you deserve, Eleanor. I have spent my whole life becoming someone very good at protecting what's his, and very bad at anything resembling tenderness. I'm afraid that whatever you're starting to feel, whatever I'm starting to feel, deserves someone with a language for it that I never learned. Then let me help you learn it, she said, and crossed the small space between them before she could talk herself out of it, kneeling by his chair the way he had once knelt by hers, taking his face in both her hands with a gentleness she felt him lean into almost involuntarily. A man starved for exactly this kind of touch, and too proud to have ever asked for it. You don't have to already know how, Dante. You just have to be willing to try. That's all any of this ever requires. He kissed her then. Not the searching, half-second too long kiss of their wedding day, performed for an audience of 300 guests, but something slower, more deliberate. A question rather than a claim, his hand coming up to cover hers where it rested against his jaw, as though he needed the anchor of her touch to believe this was actually happening. When he finally drew back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath unsteady in a way she had never once heard from him, she felt something settle between them that hadn't been there before. Not resolution, not yet, but the first real foundation of something neither debt nor duty had built, something they were choosing, slowly and imperfectly, on their own. I'm still afraid, he admitted, against her mouth, of all of it, of what it means that I love you when I was never supposed to, of what happens to the child, to us, if the Sartoris try again, of every version of this that could still go wrong. Good, Elena said, surprising herself with the fierceness in her own voice. Be afraid. Just don't leave me alone in it this time. I won't, Dante said, and for the first time since she'd known him, she believed him completely. The peace, such as it was, lasted 6 weeks, long enough for Elena to let herself believe, cautiously, that the worst of it might genuinely be behind them. It ended on a night in early March, 3 weeks before her due date, when Aldo woke the household at 2 in the morning with news that made even Dante's careful composure crack wide open. Salvatore Marchetti had been arrested. Elena stood in the front hall in her robe, watching Dante take the call, watching his face shift through several expressions she couldn't fully name, before settling into something grim and controlled. "What charges?" he said into the phone, and then a long silence, his jaw tightening. "How long have they had this information? Who fed it to them?" He hung up and turned to Elena with an expression she'd never seen from him before. Not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. A man recalculating a danger he'd believed contained. "Your father's been arrested," he said. "Federal charges. Racketeering. Conspiracy. Enough evidence apparently gathered over months that this wasn't a raid assembled overnight. Someone gave the feds information detailed enough to build an airtight case, Elena, and gave it to them recently enough that whoever it was had access to conversations happening well after our wedding." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You think it was someone in our family, feeding information to the feds?" "I think," Dante said carefully, "that the only people with detailed enough access to your father's operations in the last 8 months are people connected to this house, this marriage, or this organization. And I think whoever did it timed it deliberately, now, while I'm distracted by an unborn child and a wife I'm trying to protect from a Sartori threat. precisely because they knew it would divide my attention at the worst possible moment. It took 4 days of quiet, brutal investigation, the details of which Dante still wouldn't fully share with Elena, though she understood enough from what leaked through Aldo's careful silences to know that several men had been interrogated in rooms she never wanted to see the inside of, before the truth surfaced, and when it did, it arrived with a violence that shattered whatever fragile peace the previous 6 weeks had built. It was Vincent. Eleanor would never fully understand, even afterward, the complete tangle of motives that had driven him to it. Some combination, Dante explained grimly, of genuine belief that the marriage endangered the family's standing beyond what he could tolerate, and something darker beneath it, an old resentment towards Salvatore Marchetti, dating back decades to a betrayal in their father's generation that Vincent had apparently never fully released. He had fed the feds information about Salvatore's operations gradually over months, believing, or telling himself he believed, that removing Salvatore from play entirely would force Dante's hand. With her father imprisoned and the Marchetti crew leaderless and vulnerable, Eleanor would have no family left to return to, and Vincent had calculated, with the same cold precision he brought to everything, that a woman with nowhere else to go would finally accept the quiet fate he'd been advocating for months. Set aside, humiliated, but safely removed from a marriage he still believed threatened everything Dante had built. He thought he was protecting the family, Dante said, his voice flat with a fury Elena had never heard from him, standing in his study with the door locked, Vincent seated across from him in a chair, flanked by 2 men Elena didn't recognize. She had insisted on being present for this conversation over Dante's initial objection, and something in her insistence had apparently convinced him she'd earned the right. He decided that arresting your father would leave you with nothing, and that nothing would finally break whatever hold he believed you'd developed over me. He was willing to destroy an old man's life, willing to risk everything I've built with this family because he couldn't accept that I'd chosen something he didn't design. Vincent, remarkably, did not deny it. He sat in the chair with the particular stillness of a man who had made his calculations and now waited, with something almost like relief, to learn their cost. I did what I believed the family required, he said. I have served this organization for 30 years, Dante. I served your father before you, and I loved him as my own brother. And I have watched you, these past 8 months, dismantle everything he and I built together for the sake of a woman and a child that owe this family nothing. I am not sorry for trying to protect what we built. I am only sorry it required hurting you to do it. You didn't protect anything, Dante said, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous. You nearly destroyed everything. If it becomes known that Vincent Russo fed federal informants information about an allied family's operations, no house in this city will ever trust an alliance with us again. You didn't protect the family's honor, Vincent. You gutted it, for the sake of a grudge against a dead man's son that you've apparently been nursing since before I was born. Elena, watching this unfold, felt something cold settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly at watching Vincent's calculations collapse around him, but a kind of grim clarity about the world she now belonged to, where even the men closest to her husband could turn out to have been working quietly toward her destruction the entire time. What happens to him? She asked quietly when the silence stretched too long. Dante looked at his uncle for a long moment before answering. And something in his face, grief, she thought, buried deep beneath the fury. Grief for a man who had raised him as much as his own father had, passed across his features before he mastered it. "He'll be removed from the organization," Dante said finally. "Stripped of his position, his authority, everything he's built here over 30 years. He won't be killed, not for this, not for a betrayal born from misguided loyalty rather than treachery for its own profit. But he will leave Chicago, tonight, and he will never again involve himself in Russo business, Marchetti business, or my marriage, for as long as he lives. If I ever learn he's violated that condition, the mercy ends."
"Do you understand me, Vincent?"
"I understand," Vincent said quietly, and for the first time since Elena had met him, he looked, briefly, like an old man rather than a calculating strategist. Tired, diminished, a man watching the last 30 years of his life collapse in the space of a single conversation. Before he was led out, he turned to Elena, and something in his expression carried an apology he didn't have the words to voice directly. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I want you to know that, whatever else you think of me now. I believed you were a liability my nephew couldn't afford. I was wrong, and it cost me everything I built here to admit it too late." He left without waiting for her response, and Elena stood in the study beside her husband, watching the door close on 30 years of loyalty unmade by a single, brutal miscalculation. Understanding that whatever came next, her father's legal battles, the family's reputation, the fragile new thing growing between herself and Dante, would have to be built now without the man who had, for better and worse, shaped nearly everything about the world she'd married into. Salvatore Marchetti's arrest, though engineered by Vincent's betrayal, could not simply be undone by his exile. The federal case, once assembled, took on a momentum of its own that no amount of Russo influence could fully halt, and Elena spent the following 2 weeks in a state of raw, exhausted anxiety, torn between the demands of her own advancing pregnancy and the terror of watching her father face the possibility of a decade or more in federal prison. Dante worked the problem with a focus that surprised her, given how little her father had ever done to earn his loyalty. He met with lawyers, called in favors across 3 states, spent long nights on calls Eleanor wasn't permitted to overhear, but understood, from the exhaustion etched into his face each morning, were costing him considerable political capital he'd rather have spent elsewhere. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one night, finding him at his desk past midnight, papers spread before him, his tie long since discarded. "My father brought this on himself, years before either of us had any say in it. You don't owe him anything." "I don't owe him," Dante agreed. "I owe you." He looked up at her, and something in his face had softened past the point of careful composure entirely. "Whatever your father did, however much of this mess traces back to his mistakes, he's still the father of the child you're carrying's grandfather, and he's still someone whose fate affects you deeply, whether you'll admit that or not. I watch you not sleeping some nights, Elena, worrying about him, and I find I can't simply let that continue when I have resources to spend trying to fix it, even though it costs you." "Even though it costs me," he confirmed. "I've learned something these past months about which costs are actually worth paying. In the end, It was not entirely Dante's influence that saved Salvatore from the worst of the federal case, but a negotiation Elena hadn't anticipated. Her father, faced with the prospect of decades in prison, agreed to cooperate with investigators on cases entirely unrelated to the Russo or Marchetti families. Testimony against a corrupt union official whose corruption Salvatore had witnessed firsthand years earlier, unconnected to any of the debts or alliances that had originally brought Elena into this marriage. In exchange, his own sentence was reduced to 18 months, a plea deal his lawyers called, privately, close to miraculous, given the strength of the original case against him. Elena visited him once, before he was transferred to serve his sentence, in a grey visitation room that smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. Her pregnancy heavy enough now that she had to lower herself carefully into the plastic chair across from him. "You look well," her father said, and something in his voice carried a tenderness she hadn't heard from him in years, not since before her mother died. "Married life agrees with you, cara, whatever I feared when Vincent Russo first said your name in our kitchen." "It wasn't what either of us expected," Elena said carefully. "But it's become something I don't regret, Papa. Not anymore." "I heard about Vincent," her father said, "what he did, to both of us. I want you to know I never asked Dante to spend anything protecting me. I know what I did to bring this on myself, years before you were even old enough to understand what our family did for a living. I've made my peace with paying for it." "He didn't do it for you," Elena said. "Not really. He did it because he knew it mattered to me. And somewhere in the last 8 months, what matters to me started mattering more to him than the old rules ever did." Her father studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving across his weathered face. "I was afraid, that night in the kitchen, that I'd handed my daughter to a monster simply to save my own skin," he said finally. "I think, watching you now, that I may have handed you to something else entirely, without ever meaning to. I hope I'm right about that, Elena. I hope, whatever else I've cost you, that I haven't cost you the chance at something real." "You haven't," Elena said, and found, saying it, that she believed it completely. "Whatever this started as, Papa, it isn't that anymore." She left the visitation room with a strange, unexpected peace settling into her chest. Not joy, exactly, given everything her father still had to face, but a quiet resolution of an old wound she'd been carrying since that terrible night in his kitchen 8 months ago. Whatever debt he had incurred, whatever price she had been made to pay for it, she found she could finally look at the whole tangled history of it, the debt, the marriage, Vincent's betrayal, the child growing inside her, without the bitter resentment that had coloured her earliest months in the Russo family, and understand it, instead, as simply the strange, brutal, occasionally redemptive machinery of a world she had been born into and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, found her own fragile happiness within. Dante was waiting for her outside the prison, leaning against the car in the grey afternoon light, and something in his face when he saw her, worry, tenderness, an unguarded relief at simply seeing her safe, told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly this marriage had transformed since the night he'd left her alone in a hotel suite without a single word of explanation. "How was he?" Dante asked, opening the car door for her with a care that had become, over these past months, entirely instinctive rather than performed. Resigned, Elena said. Grateful, I think, though he'd never say it plainly. He knows what you spent to help him, Dante, even the parts of it you didn't tell me. It wasn't for him, Dante said, echoing without knowing it the exact words she'd spoken to her father minutes before.
I know, Elena said, and let him help her into the car, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that whatever storms still lay ahead, and she understood, watching the prison recede behind them, that there would be more storms yet, in a life built on this particular foundation. She would not have to weather them entirely alone. The final threat came not from Vincent's betrayal or her father's legal troubles, but from the source Eleanor had almost let herself forget in the chaos of the preceding weeks. The Sartori family, whose truce, it turned out, had never been more than a strategic pause while their remaining leadership regrouped and waited for precisely the moment of maximum Russo vulnerability to strike again. That moment arrived 9 days before Eleanor's due date. She was alone in the townhouse, Dante at the Rush Street offices dealing with a shipment crisis, Aldo posted at the front gate, Rosa out running errands, when the back garden's newly installed security cameras caught 2 men scaling the rear wall in the grey hour just before dusk. The alarm Dante had insisted on installing after the Lakeshore Drive attack triggered immediately, but not before one of the men had made it through the garden door and into the kitchen, where Elena, heavily pregnant and moving with the particular slowness of a woman 9 days from labour, found herself trapped between the intruder and the stairs. She would replay the next several minutes for the rest of her life with a kind of disbelieving clarity, the way her body, despite its unwieldy weight, had somehow found the speed to snatch the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stovetop and swing it with every ounce of strength fear could provide, catching the intruder across the temple, hard enough to send him staggering into the counter. The way she'd screamed for Aldo, with a volume she hadn't known her lungs still possessed at this stage of pregnancy. The way the second man had appeared in the kitchen doorway just as Aldo burst through the front entrance, gun already drawn, moving with a speed that belied his usual careful gentleness. The exchange of gunfire lasted less than 15 seconds. When it ended, both intruders lay dead on the kitchen floor, and Aldo was pressing a shaking hand against a graze wound on his own shoulder. And Elena was sliding down against the cabinets with a pain in her abdomen that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the fact that her body, under the extraordinary stress of the last several minutes, had apparently decided this was the moment to begin labour, 9 days ahead of schedule. Dante arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later to find Elena already 3 centimetres dilated, her hand crushing Rosa's with a grip born of pure terror and pain, and the expression on his face when he burst through the door, stripped entirely of every careful mask he'd ever worn, nothing left but raw, naked fear, told her, more than any words could have, exactly how far this marriage had travelled from the cold architecture it had started as. "I'm here," he said, taking her other hand, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't even attempt to hide. "I'm here, Elena. I'm not leaving. I promise you, I am not leaving this room." "The Sartoris," she managed between contractions. "Are they—" "Dead," Dante said grimly. "Both of them.
and I intend to make certain, before this week is finished, that whoever sent them understands precisely what happens to men who go after my family." Something in his voice, even through his obvious fear for her, carried an absolute, terrible certainty that told Elena the Sartori threat, whatever remained of it, would not survive what came next. "But right now, none of that matters. Right now, I need you to breathe, and I need you to let me be here for this, the way I should have been there for you from the very first night." Labour lasted 11 hours, through which Dante did not leave her side once, not for the calls Eleanor knew must have been flooding his phone about the security breach, not for the retaliation she understood, even in the fog of contractions, was already being coordinated by men outside this room. Not even when the doctors, at one difficult stretch near the end, suggested gently that fathers sometimes preferred to wait outside for the final push. "I'm not her husband by accident anymore," he told the doctor, quietly, but with an absolute finality that ended the conversation. "I'm staying." When their daughter was finally born, small, furious, red-faced and screaming, with a set of lungs that made even the exhausted delivery room staff smile, Dante held her for the first time with hands that visibly trembled, looking down at a child that carried none of his blood, with an expression Elena would never forget for the rest of her life. Not the careful, dutiful tenderness of a man honouring a promise made in front of his organisation, but something entirely unguarded, entirely real. The naked wonder of a man discovering he was capable of a love he had never believed himself built for. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "God, Elena, I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now." "You don't need words," Elena said, exhausted and radiant and crying despite herself. "Just don't let go of her." "I won't," he said, and something in the way he said it, the same absolute certainty he'd carried into every promise he'd made her since the night of the Sartori attack on Lakeshore Drive, told her he meant it not as a formality, not as an honour obligation performed for the sake of his organisation's respect, but as the simple, unguarded truth of a man who had, somewhere in the last 9 impossible months, become genuinely, irrevocably, a father. They named her Sophia, after Dante's mother, the woman whose battered copy of Neruda still sat on the library shelf. And in the quiet hours after the birth, with Sophia sleeping against Dante's chest, and Elena watching them both with an exhaustion that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely peaceful, she understood that whatever remained of the Sartori threat, whatever reckoning still waited for the men who had sent assassins into her own kitchen, she was no longer facing any of it alone. And neither, she realized, watching her husband's face as he studied their daughter's small, sleeping features, was he. The reckoning Dante had promised came within the week, delivered with the same absolute, efficient finality he brought to everything he decided mattered enough to spend himself on completely. Elena learned of it only in fragments, the Sartori family's remaining leadership structure collapsing almost overnight, a series of arrests and disappearances that the news attributed to internal power struggles, rather than the truth Elena now understood well enough to recognize beneath the surface. Whatever Dante had done, it ended the threat entirely. No attempt, however small, was ever made against the Russo family again in all the years that followed. But it was the quieter reckoning that mattered more to Elena in the weeks after Sophia's birth. The reckoning within their own house, between herself
and Dante, about what kind of family they intended to actually build together, now that the debts and betrayals that had brought them together had finally, mostly, been settled. Marco came once more, in Sophia's third week of life. Not to the house, which remained under security too tight for any unannounced visit to succeed, but through a formal request delivered via intermediary, asking, with a humility that surprised Elena, whether he might be permitted to see the child once, simply to know she was safe and well. Dante considered the request for 2 days before bringing it to Elena directly, in the quiet of their bedroom, Sophia asleep in the bassinet beside them. "I want to know what you want," he said, and she understood, from the careful way he asked it, that this was a genuine question rather than a test of her loyalty. "He's her father, biologically, whatever else that means to either of us. I won't pretend that fact doesn't complicate things, but I've spent enough of this marriage making decisions about your life without consulting you, Eleanor, and I don't intend to make this one that way." She thought about it for a long time before answering, thought about Marco's face in the nightclub, the raw fear in his voice when he'd asked whether she was safe, the poetry-soft memory of a summer 2 years past that she no longer regretted, but had, somewhere in the last 9 months, released from any claim on her present. "I think he deserves to see her once," she said finally. "Not as a father. Not in any way that complicates what Sophia will grow up understanding about her family, but as a man who loved me before any of this happened to either of us, and who has spent 9 months not knowing whether she was even born safely. I think that deserves an answer, even if it's the only answer he ever gets." Dante studied her for a long moment. "And after that?" "After that," Eleanor said, "she's ours, yours and mine. I don't think that needs to be complicated, Dante, whatever her blood says. You were in that delivery room for 11 hours. You've held her every night since. Marco loved a version of me that doesn't exist anymore, in a life that ended the night your uncle came to my father's kitchen. I don't think there's room in Sophia's actual life for anything more than the one visit I'm asking you to allow him." Something in Dante's face, hearing this, released a tension Elena hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "I was afraid," he admitted quietly, "that giving him this would open a door neither of us could close again. That somewhere, in watching him hold her, some part of you would want—" "I know what you were afraid of," Elena said gently, reaching for his hand. "You don't have to be. Whatever I felt for Marco belongs to a girl who didn't know yet what it meant to be truly chosen, rather than merely assigned. You've spent 9 months choosing me, Dante, and choosing her, every single day, in every way that actually matters. That isn't something a single visit from her biological father is going to unmake." The visit, when it happened, lasted less than 20 minutes, conducted in the neutral territory of Aldo's own modest apartment, with both Dante and Aldo present, though at a careful, respectful distance. Elena watched Marco hold his daughter with hands that shook slightly, watched something in his face settle into a grief that was also, unmistakably, a kind of peace. The particular resolution of a man finally allowed to say goodbye to a life he had once imagined for himself, in order to make room for whatever life he might build instead. "She has your eyes," he told Elena quietly,
handing Sophia back with a gentleness that broke something in Elena's chest even now. I'm glad. I'm glad she'll grow up looking at the world the way you do. Thank you for asking permission, Elena said.
For not showing up unannounced, for understanding what this had to be. I understand more than you'd think, Marco said, glancing once briefly at Dante, who stood near the window with a stillness that Elena recognized now not as coldness, but as careful, deliberate restraint. A man giving another man a moment he badly wanted to interrupt, and chose, out of something like respect, not to. He's good to you. I can see that, watching the two of you together. I hope you find whatever it is you're actually looking for, Elena. I think, watching this, that you might already have. He left without asking to see her again, and something in the finality of his departure told Elena this really was the ending. Not a door slammed shut in anger, but one closed gently, with genuine care, by a man releasing the last claim he had any right to make. Dante was quiet on the drive home, Sophia asleep in her car seat, the city lights sliding past the window, in a scene that echoed, faintly, the lonely ride Elena had taken alone on her wedding night, though everything about this version of it felt entirely different. Thank you, he said finally, as they pulled into the townhouse's gated drive, for trusting me enough to ask what you wanted, instead of simply managing me, the way this family taught everyone else to be managed. I'm not managing anything anymore, Dante, Elena said. I'm choosing. There's a difference. And it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand it. But I understand it now. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and they sat together in the quiet of the car for a long moment before either of them moved to go inside, Sophia sleeping soundly between them, the debt that had once defined every part of Elena's existence, finally, fully, transformed into something neither of them had ever expected to find on the other side of it. 6 months after Sophia's birth, on a warm evening in late autumn, Dante did something that surprised even Aldo, who had by then witnessed nearly every version of his boss's careful, controlled decision-making over the better part of a decade. He asked Elena to marry him again. Not legally. Their marriage before God and the state had never lapsed, had in fact grown into something neither of them had believed possible on the cold, transactional evening of their first ceremony. But Dante arranged, quietly, and without any of the political theatre that had defined their original wedding, a small ceremony in the walled garden of the Astor Street townhouse, attended only by Rosa, Aldo, Elena's father, released early for good behaviour, thinner and greyer, but genuinely present in a way Elena hadn't seen from him in years, and Sophia herself, 6 months old and utterly unbothered by the significance of the occasion, gurgling happily in her grandfather's arms throughout the entire ceremony. I don't need the church or the alliance or any of the architecture we built the first time, Dante told her, standing beneath the same bare trees where Vincent had once told her the terms of her own imprisonment, holding her hands with none of the careful, ceremonial distance of their first vows. I asked for your hand once because a debt demanded it, and I stood at that altar calculating what our marriage would mean for my organization's respect, rather than what it might mean for either of us as people. I want to make different vows tonight, Elena, ones that have nothing to do with debts or honor or anything except the truth of what I actually feel for you. He had written his own vows, she would learn later, in the quiet hours after Sophia's late-night feedings, working through draft after draft in a hand she recognized from the poetry he still occasionally read aloud to their daughter, awkward and unpracticed, in a language he had spent his whole adult life avoiding. "I promise," he said, his voice carrying none of the flat, controlled authority she remembered from their first ceremony, "to never again leave you alone in a room without explanation. Whatever war or crisis demands my attention elsewhere. I promise to make you my priority, in fact, not merely in the words I say to my organization about it. I promise to raise our daughter, because she is ours, whatever her blood says, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never doubts that, with the same fierce, complete love I've spent this last year learning to give you. And I promise, Elena Marchetti Russo, that whatever debts brought us together, whatever forced this marriage into existence against both our wills, I am choosing you now, freely and completely, in a way no one forced me to do the first time. I love you."
I should have told you that months ago, and I am only sorry it took me this long to find the courage to say it as simply and directly as it deserves to be said. Elena, crying openly now, found her own vows waiting in her chest with none of the difficulty she'd expected. "I came into this marriage believing I'd lost every choice I'd ever get to make about my own life," she said. "I spent months believing I'd married architecture, strategy, a stranger who saw me as nothing more than a useful alliance. I was wrong, Dante. Or rather, I was right about the beginning, and wrong to believe the beginning would define everything that came after. You gave me a home when I expected only a cage. You gave our daughter a father's love when the world would have understood completely if you'd walked away instead. You taught me that some debts, paid in full, somehow deliver you to something better than what you lost. Not because the debt itself was fair, but because of who you become in the process of surviving it. I love you too. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit, even to myself. I choose you freely, the way you're choosing me tonight. Whatever comes next, I don't want to face any of it without you standing exactly where you're standing now." They kissed, as husband and wife, for the second time in their lives, in a quiet garden instead of a crowded church, with none of the audience or architecture of their first ceremony. And this time, when Dante drew back, his eyes were wet in a way she had never once seen from him, and he laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised and entirely unguarded, at his own tears, at the absurdity and the wonder of a man who had built his entire life around never being vulnerable, standing in his own garden, weeping openly in front of the small handful of people who mattered most in his life. "Look what you've done to me," he said, wiping his eyes with a rueful smile that Elena had come to treasure precisely because it was so rare. Salvatore Greco would have a stroke if he saw this. "Salvatore Greco can mind his own business," Elena said, laughing through her own tears, and pulled him down for a second kiss that lasted rather longer than the first. Salvatore Marchetti, watching from his chair with Sophia asleep against his shoulder, caught Elena's eye across the small gathering and raised his glass in a silent toast. An old man's apology, finally, fully accepted. A debt of an entirely different kind finally settled between father and daughter. One built not on blood or violence, but on the simple, hard-won understanding
that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you turns out, against every reasonable expectation, to deliver you somewhere you'd never have found any other way. 5 years passed, and the story of Dante Russo's marriage became, in the particular oral history of Chicago's underworld, something closer to legend than gossip. The tale of a kingpin who had married a debt, and somehow, against every rule his world had ever taught him, found in it the truest love of his life. Sophia Russo grew into a fierce, curious child with her mother's dark eyes and her adoptive father's absolute, unshakable stillness under pressure. A combination that made her, even at 5 years old, somewhat legendary among the household staff for her ability to negotiate extra dessert out of even the most disciplined kitchen help. She called Dante Papa without a moment's hesitation, had done so since she was old enough to speak at all, and on the rare occasions when the complicated truth of her parentage came up, usually initiated by Elena, gently, at an age Elena judged old enough to begin understanding it, Sophia absorbed the information with the particular unbothered practicality of a child for whom love had never once been in question. "So Marco is like my other father, but not really my papa," she said once at 6, working through the concept with the serious concentration she brought to everything. "And Papa is my real Papa, even though he's not my blood Papa." "Something like that," Eleanor said, smiling despite the weight the conversation carried. "Does that confuse you?" "No," Sophia said, with the total confidence of a child who had never once doubted where she belonged. "Papa is the one who reads me stories and teaches me to swim and gets scared when I climb too high on the garden wall. That's what makes him my papa. The rest is just—" She waved her small hand, dismissing the entire complicated architecture of blood and debt and betrayal that had once nearly destroyed her parents' marriage before it had properly begun. "Just details." Elena told Dante about the conversation that night in the quiet of their bedroom, and watched something in his face soften into the particular unguarded tenderness that had become, over the years, entirely unremarkable to her, though it had once seemed impossible from the cold, controlled man she'd married in a church full of strangers. "Just details," he repeated, something wet gathering in his eyes that he no longer bothered hiding from her. God, 6 years old, and she already understands what took me 35 years and a debt I never asked for to learn. Vincent Russo, true to the terms of his exile, never returned to Chicago, and never again involved himself in Russo business, though he wrote once a year a brief letter to Dante that Elena understood from the careful way her husband read and reread each one, carried some measure of reconciliation neither man had ever fully put into words. He died 6 years after his exile in a small house on the Florida coast, and Dante attended the funeral alone, returning home quiet and reflective in a way that told Elena more about the complicated grief of losing a man who had both raised him and betrayed him than any conversation between them ever could have. Marco Ferretti married, 3 years after Sophia's birth, a woman from outside either family's business entirely. A schoolteacher, Elena heard, kind and unconnected to any of the violence that had once defined both their lives, and moved eventually to Milwaukee, where he opened a small bakery of his own, the last echo of the flour-dusted apartment above his uncle's shop, where he and Elena had once imagined an entirely different future for themselves. He sent, every year on Sophia's birthday, a card with no return address, containing nothing but a single line of well wishes and, once, a small hand-drawn picture of a bakery that Elena kept quietly
In a drawer she never showed anyone, but understood she would never bring herself to throw away. Salvatore Marchetti, released from prison and genuinely reformed in the particular way that only real consequence seems capable of producing, spent his remaining years as a doting, endlessly indulgent grandfather, showing up at the Astor Street townhouse with a frequency that occasionally exasperated Dante's security detail and delighted Sophia beyond measure. He died peacefully 8 years after Elena's wedding, in the same chair, in the same garden, where he had once watched his daughter marry a man he'd been terrified of, having lived long enough to see that terror transform completely into something he could only describe in his final years as gratitude.
And Dante Russo, the coldest, most dangerous man in Chicago, a kingpin who had built an empire on the absolute conviction that vulnerability invited death, spent the rest of his life proving, quietly and completely, that he had been wrong about that single conviction in the one way that mattered most. He never stopped being dangerous. The empire he ran demanded exactly the ruthless competence that had built it, and he never once flinched from what that competence required of him when his family's safety was at stake. But at home, in the quiet of the Astor Street garden, in the library where Neruda's poetry still sat beside a growing collection of Sophia's favourite bedtime stories, in the bedroom where he still, every single night, reached for Elena's hand before either of them fell asleep, he had become something the old rules of his world had never taught him was possible. A man who had learned, against every instinct trained into him since he was 12 years old, burying his own father, that love was not a weakness to be hidden, but the single, truest form of strength he had ever managed to build. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked him once, years later. The two of them sitting together in the garden on a warm summer evening, watching Sophia chase fireflies across the lawn with the particular reckless joy of a child who had never once doubted she was loved completely. The debt, the marriage, everything that brought us here. Dante considered the question with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything that mattered to him, watching their daughter's laughter carry across the darkening garden. "I regret the wedding night," he said finally. "I regret every day I left you alone in that hotel without explanation. Every week I let you believe I saw you as nothing more than strategy. I regret Vincent's betrayal and the fear you carried through your pregnancy, and every moment of this that could have gone differently, more gently, with less cost to either of us." He turned to her, and something in his eyes carried the full weight of everything they had survived together to arrive at this particular quiet evening. "But I don't regret the debt itself, Elena. Whatever brought you to me, whatever forced this marriage into existence against both our wills, I would pay that same debt 1,000 times over, in any currency demanded, simply to arrive again at this exact garden, this exact evening, watching our daughter chase fireflies, while you sit beside me as my wife." Some debts, it turns out, aren't punishments at all. They're simply the strange, difficult architecture through which certain kinds of love are built, when no gentler path was ever going to be available to either of us. Elena reached for his hand in the fading light, and he took it the way he always did now, completely, without hesitation. A man who had learned, finally and fully, that some debts, once paid, don't diminish you at all. They deliver you instead to the single truest thing you never knew you were owed.